Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's hard to believe, class of 2003. It was 12 years ago when I was sitting where you are now, starting orientation for the Harris School. It does not feel that long ago. It goes by very quickly. But I'm so happy to be here today and have the opportunity to talk with you all as you're starting this 2-year journey, which I know I got a lot out of, and I'm hoping you guys will see this as an opportunity as well. And, you know, at Brookings, we love bullet points. And we love when things come in threes. So today I'm going to talk to you about 3 things. I want to tell you a bit about my background, what I learned when I was at Harris School, and how that actually relates to the work that I do today. So I will get into the book a little bit more and show you how I'm applying what Harris taught me in my professional career, which I do all the time. In terms of where I came from, I actually was a history major in undergrad, and I avoided all things quantitative as much as possible. I really thought I was going to go on to be a history teacher and felt like that was my path forward, and math was something I could leave over here. Until I actually took a short-term contract at a think tank after I graduated undergrad, and I was back home in Indianapolis, and just being in that environment, and if you cast your minds back, this was in 2000. So we're in the middle of a presidential election that turned out to be quite, contentious. There were a lot of policy issues that were being argued about every day all around me in this environment. And I thought, yes, this is what I want to do. This is the sort of experience that I want to have. I want to be able to analyze policy as it's unfolding and weigh in on the policy discussion, rather than looking at it from just a historical context. But my most immediate problem was that math piece and how much I had avoided any sort of statistics or economics in undergrad. And I knew very quickly if I were looking for a graduate degree that I would need to build out that part of my skill set, that I would want those hard skills that would help me do the kind of analysis that I had seen going on in this think tank and the kind of analysis that I would want to be a part of in my professional life. And very quickly, as I started looking at policy programs, the Harris School sort of rose to the top of the list. And in talking to people working around me at the think tank, they very much spoke highly of the Harris program as a very good quantitative, nuts and bolt, high quality degree that gives you the sort of skill sets that you need. And for me, that was exactly what I was looking for. And in applying to the Harris School, I would say, wait, I should ask, are we pre-math camp or post-math camp at this point? Oh, so you made it. Good job. I definitely remember very quickly jumping into the deep end with math camp. And honestly, some of my very close best friends today are people that I bonded with over problem sets in math camp and problem sets in our first quarter of micro and stats. Make your networks now and use each other. That's my number 1 tip for you. The very, very first thing setting out. You can really be each other's best resource in acquiring these new skills and learning all this new and exciting stuff. And in terms of what I learned from Harris, kind of moving to that second bullet point, first, of course, I would say that the group of people that Harris manages to attract and assemble in these classes is such a really interesting, diverse mix of people. And I know I learned a lot just from that, just from having the people in the program around me coming from such interesting places and being able to discuss these topics and issues that we were concerned about, and also struggle together on problem sets and just climbing the hill of the MPP. And also, of course, the faculty. I still remember professors that were very formative in the way that I approached issues, the way that I learned about things, and building that analytical skill set that was so important to me at the time. But you also, I want to say, beyond just the people here, make sure that you take advantage of Chicago. I mean, this is really one of the big benefits of being here, is that you're in the middle of a city where so much is going on. And there's so many ways to get involved in exactly the kind of stuff that you're going to be studying every day, whether it's from a nonprofit perspective, a local government perspective, business perspective. There's just so much going on. It's a very dynamic city. So really take advantage of that, whether that's through internships or informational interviews, or just going to public forums and meetings that are being held around the city. I mean, soak it in, because that's the real work. I mean, that's the real application of the kind of stuff that you're learning. And I found that to just be such a rich environment to start practicing all the skills that I was learning. Beyond that, I mean, there's the program itself. Clearly, I feel like What Harris equipped me to do was, A, build up that quantitative skill set that I found I got a really important toolbox, this sort of central critical skill set that I had been neglecting, and it helped me to build that up. If anything, yes, I'm not going to be a full-blown economist at this point in my career. I'm not going to be a full-blown statistician, but I know how to do the basics. And what, if anything, it made me is a critical consumer of these kinds of analytics. Is that you will find it really is so powerful, just being able to read with a critical eye the policy discourse that you see going on around you. And what I also appreciate about it, the Harris School, is so that was at the foundation. This was like the core. But there's a lot of flexibility in how you build around that. And again, I would really encourage you to take advantage of that, whether it's within the Harris School in terms of the types of substantive classes you build around your quantitative work, or getting out elsewhere on campus. I know I benefited from that, going to other schools. Like for me, because of my interest in community and economic development and issues that affect low-income people and places, I took a number of classes at SSA just down the road. I also took classes in the geography school because I was interested in the spatial way that these things play out. But I had a lot of friends who were at the law school, at the business school. I mean, really, it is what you make of it. Excuse me. So I would just suggest that you really, tap into these resources that are there for you and take advantage of it. And the other thing I would say beyond just the quantitative skill set that Harris really drove home was not just how to analytically think about something, but how do you communicate about it? How do you process information and then actually turn that into, I know you guys are going to get your fill of this, but policy memos, that is a really good thing. That's a really good skill to learn. The idea of front-loading information, reading a bunch of information, a bunch of data, and being able to process that down to bullet points, to front-loaded thoughts and statements, to come up with an analysis, but present it and communicate it in a way that makes sense and is digestible, so important. And I think that's where I will come to what I do today and actually how I apply everything that the Harris School has taught me. So, of course, I work now at the Brookings Institution. I didn't immediately go there after graduate school. When I finished, I actually started at a community development financial institution in Chicago called IFF. It used to be called the Illinois Facilities Fund, but now it works in 5 states, so it goes just by IFF. And they were just developing a research department at the time. And I was the lucky first member of that department. And one reason I got that opportunity is actually because I was interning there before finishing my second year. So again, look for these opportunities because they can really open up some doors for you moving on. But this was a really excellent opportunity for me to see the way that you could take quantitative analysis but apply it to practice, to actual decisions about where to target services, how to align those kinds of programs to communities that were most in need of them. If it was something like subsidized childcare or public schools, performing public schools, how do you see how that maps on to the populations using those resources and think about allocating resources differently? So applied research, which is a really big takeaway from me. And I really got a lot out of my 2 years working at IFF. And then when I decided, though, that I wanted to try and broaden my research focus beyond just Illinois, but thinking about more national issues, had the opportunity to come to DC and to work in the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings. And in the work that I've been doing there is such an emphasis not just on analyzing the pressing policy concerns of the day, but again, really formulating that and communicating that so that decision makers from the federal level on down can make informed decisions about how they approach policy change, about how they implement the programs and the resources that they have. And in fact, today, the reason that I'm here is actually because I'm doing a series of meetings in this region where, again, we'll talk about the book, because I think maybe the easiest way to talk about this is to show you some of the research that we've been doing. But the whole point was not just writing the book. I mean, it's great. There's a book now. That's very exciting. But the idea is, what are people going to do with that book? What are we going to do with the recommendations coming out of that work? And that takes engagement. And that's really, again, where I think communicating policy analysis becomes such an important facet of whatever you choose to do, whether it's in the public sector, the private sector. Being able to make your point and help people make informed decisions is so important. And so, and in rolling out the book, we're not just doing a typical book tour, where I go to Barnes and Nobles and read a few passages and maybe some people buy some books. Instead, we're really trying to connect with decision makers who can have an influence over policy and practice. This morning, I did a briefing with the Cook County Economic Development Advisory Council about this work and how it might inform their thinking about economic development policy in the region. After I leave you here today, we're actually going out to the suburbs to meet with the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, again, to talk to suburban mayors about this landscape of poverty and what they can do to help make sure they're connecting people to opportunity and pathways that help them get out of poverty in the long run. We're going to continue talking in the region tomorrow to funders, philanthropy, and what the philanthropic role is. We're doing a meeting at the Federal Reserve Bank with heads of human services, with elected officials, agencies, the business development community, the financial sector, really bringing different stakeholders together, again, to really build on this conversation and understand the implications of this research for all the work that they do and how we can make connections across sectors. So I think it'll be easiest for me to sort of walk you through some of the work that I've been doing, and you can see the analytical piece behind it. Thanks to Harris for helping me build those skills. But then also we can talk more about that communications piece. How do you really help move policy by connecting with the stakeholders and decision makers around the work that you're doing? So here's basically the abbreviated version of the remarks that I'm going to be giving to the Mayor's Caucus later today, where we're going to go through the trends and the research that we've done and talk about the implications for policy and communities moving forward. So one, really this work came around looking at the distribution of poverty across cities and suburbs in the nation's 100 largest metro areas. And what you'll see that is so striking here is not just that poverty has grown across cities and suburbs over the decades, or even the magnitude of growth that we saw in the 2000s. Truly, the 2000s were a staggering decade in terms of the rapid increases we saw in poverty. But the fastest pace of growth and poverty across our country actually happened in the suburbs of our major metro areas in the 2000s. From 2000 to 2012, the poor population grew by 65%. In a very short time period. And that was more than twice the pace of growth of the large cities that anchor those regions. And so for the first time, we actually passed this tipping point. And there are now more poor residents living in suburbs than in major cities of our nation's largest metropolitan areas. And, that's not something that just happened because of the recession. This is actually something that has been building over time. In fact, that tipping point, we crossed that in the early 2000s. And it's been since the 80s that we've seen the pace of growth in the suburban poor population start to outstrip central cities. So this is something that's been really playing out over decades, but the 2000s is when we saw this pivotal shift. If you look in the Chicago region in particular, you can see the transformative 2000s in terms of these trends. Between 2000 and 2012, the suburban poor population almost doubled in the region. And for the first time, there are more poor residents living outside of the city than in it. So this is a really rapid shift in a very short amount of time. And so how do communities start to begin to deal with this? And I think it's also important to point out that this isn't something that's just an inner ring problem. It's not just the suburbs that are right over the city lines that are dealing with this. We've actually seen rising poverty reach really far out into the region. It's touching more people in places than ever before. And really what this underscores for us is that this is a regional problem. It's something the city continues to grapple with, and now suburbs are also increasingly facing these challenges. So why is this happening? I mean, we can look at the rising poor in the suburbs, and there are a number of factors that can help explain that. Briefly, one, population. Suburbs actually grew faster than cities in our major metro areas, and in this region, the population in cities actually dropped while suburbs continued to grow. So as suburbs grew, they became more diverse, both economically and demographically. One of those facets to this is immigration. Increasingly new immigrants to the country are bypassing central cities altogether and moving to suburban communities. And if we look in this region, we could see that the growth in the suburban poor population, about 19% of that was foreign-born residents. So again, it's not driving this trend, but it's a facet that's helping to shape these dynamics in our major metro areas. One of the pull factors that we can look at for why people might be moving to the suburbs are things like the affordable housing patterns within regions. Either suburban housing has aged and become more affordable over time, It can be housing price pressures in the city as urban neighborhoods redevelop and you look outward for more affordable places in comparison. We also know the foreclosure crisis was a very suburban crisis in its impact. More than 70% of the foreclosures in this region happened outside the city of Chicago. And also looking at what might determine where people move within a region is where jobs are. And in fact, in this region, 2/3 of jobs are more than 10 miles away from the central business district. So it's a very suburbanized region in terms of employment patterns. And in fact, jobs in things in industries like retail or services, construction, jobs that tend to pay low wages, and jobs that were hit hard by the housing crisis and the related recession, those are even more suburbanized on average. So that's where the jobs are. That's where people are going to move. But again, it's not just about people moving into these places over time that's driving these trends. It's also about longer-term residents slipping down the economic ladder. On one hand, we can look at the recession as a more recent push in the rising poverty numbers that we've seen. And this one was definitely more suburban in its impact than previous recessions. But we can also look at structural changes in the economy, like the fact that jobs that are growing fastest, particularly since the recovery, are often occupations that pay lower wages. So even if you're working full-time, it may not be enough to get a family above the poverty line. So all of these factors sort of mix together in ways that help drive these trends. But what does it all mean? Obviously, being poor no matter where you live is a whole host of challenges come along with that. But there are actually some additional challenges that can be unique to the suburban experience of poverty. One, if you think about transit access, transportation tends to be less available in the first place in suburban communities. And for suburban communities that have access to transit, they reach a much smaller share of the region's jobs within a 90-minute commute. If you're a resident in a low-income suburb in the Chicago region, after a 90-minute commute on a Monday morning, you can reach only about 14% of the region's jobs. So that raises concerns about what we call a spatial mismatch, where you can afford to live and where the jobs are growing are often different places, and there may not be connections between them that make it easy for you to reach those kinds of opportunities. There are also concerns when you think just about safety net services. The suburban safety net tends to be much thinner and much patchier than in urban areas, which have had decades to sort of build up this infrastructure over time to deal with the challenges of poverty. So you may have fewer providers to begin with. Often the range of services available is much patchier. You have providers stretched over greater distances, and they've seen really rapid increases in demand, particularly since the recession. At the same time, they're often facing budget cuts or stagnant budgets, so not able to really meet that increased growth in need. And they're also reporting that they're seeing many more people come through the doors looking for help who've never been attached to the safety net before. They're looking for assistance for the first time. And they may have waited until the very last moment, and they have exhausted every other opportunity or safety net they personally may have. So they have many critical needs, which makes them even that much more of a critical case to try and address with these limited services. And part of this also reflects a lag, not only in our perceptions of where poverty is, but also in the funding to deal with poverty. Philanthropic funding is still much more targeted towards urban areas. In the Chicago region, if you look at services for low-income residents, we have about $68 per poor person in funding, in philanthropic funding coming into the city. In the suburbs, it's $2 per poor person. So there's still a real gap, a real lag in the way that we're funding and targeting resources to deal with this challenge. Part of this is a chicken and the egg kind of a question, though. If you don't have a strong provider in the suburbs, they often can't win a grant. But if funders want to, grant in the suburbs, how do you build that capacity unless you're investing in it? So it really becomes a sort of chicken and egg downward spiral of trying to build capacity in these struggling places. And we also see the impact on schools. Schools in the suburbs have shown a faster growth in their free and reduced price lunch population in recent years. And often, again, resources have not kept pace. And particularly in a community where the safety net might not be that strong, schools are often on the front lines. Families come to them first and looking for help with things much more broad than just academic assistance, things like food pantries or clothing pantries, dental or medical services. So you do see some schools trying to build in those wraparound supports to meet the growing need when there's nobody else to step in, and trying to do that, again, with very limited resources. And part of the challenge that we face in terms of the policy landscape in dealing with today's geography of poverty is the fact that we have a legacy system that was built for a different era. I mean, really, since the 50 years since the War on Poverty, we have created a number of programs. We count over 80 that deal with alleviating poverty in place in the context of community. That's $82 billion a year that we spend. But this money is fragmented across 10 different agencies, across more than 80 different programs. And many of these programs were built with distressed inner cities in mind, and therefore don't map easily onto the suburban context. So it can be very difficult to try and adapt these services into newly struggling suburban communities. And suburbs, in addition to that fragmented legacy system, face other challenges as well. One, a lack of capacity. And we talked about philanthropic and nonprofit capacity before, but I mean in terms of just municipal services or county services. Often there may not be that staffing in place or even the department that can deal with issues affecting low-income families. And now that they're seeing rapid growth in that population in a budget-strained environment, it's very difficult to ratchet up and be able to address those challenges. And suburbs themselves are often really fragmented. I mean, if you look outside of Chicago, there are more than 300 jurisdictions that make up the suburbs in this region. And some of them can be really quite small. And on their own, it's difficult to effectively tackle these issues when they themselves those issues are working at a regional level. So they can be very difficult in the suburban context. And then you put them in the funding landscape where you have this very inflexible system, and it often proves unreliable. You look at grant cycles and funding cycles, and even just the shifting priorities of philanthropy and government agencies. It can be very difficult to plan in a sustainable way for how do you actually fund the resources and issues that you need to deal with growing poverty. We have a great example from the south side of Chicago of how the system can be very difficult to navigate in a suburban context. There were 19 communities on Chicago's south side. These were communities that were hit hardest by the foreclosure crisis. They had higher rates of foreclosure than anywhere else in the region, including the city. And when the neighborhood stabilization funds were made available at the federal level, instead of competing against each other, these 19 places, which again didn't have the capacity themselves to really administer these programs, decided to get together and apply collectively. And they had the help of some really strong regional intermediaries that could help them navigate the system, like the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, the Metropolitan Planning Council, these regional providers that were able to help give them the technical assistance they need to apply for this money. And, in the end, they were successful in receiving $9 million, but because these federal funds were not used to working in this way, instead of funding the collaborative, they funded 11 municipalities separately. So you lose all of those efficiencies of scale that you get from working together as a collaborative. Now, and we'll come back to that example because they have been able to make headway, but it just shows how intractable this system can be and difficult to navigate in a suburban context. But that's not to say there aren't good things happening. Even with this really broad scale of need and the rapid increases that we've seen, even with this legacy system that's very fragmented, when we traveled around the country and researching this book, we found leaders coming from all different kinds of sectors and all different kinds of communities that were thinking about smarter ways to address today's geography of poverty and connecting people to opportunity. And, from these organizations, we saw that they were really finding ways to be the quarterback, what we call the quarterback in this region, taking this jumble of programs and making sense of them, braiding them together, pulling in state and local funding, pulling in private and philanthropic funding, and finding ways to really make this work in a cohesive whole to stretch dollars further to help more people in more places. And, they were doing this in three ways. They were finding out how to work at a smarter scale to approach the problem. They were figuring out how to collaborate and integrate, both across jurisdictions, but across policy silos and sectors. And they were figuring out how to fund strategically. Again, really thinking about how do we make these limited dollars stretch further and be more effective in how we deploy them. So to just give you a few examples of these sort of leaders, and in fact, many of them come from the Chicago region, so that's what I wanted to present to you today. One, and it's not just because I used to work here, this Illinois Facilities Fund, now known as IFF, is a really great example of a scaled organization. This is an organization that started as a very small loan fund focused just on the city of Chicago and nonprofits working in low-income and disinvested areas. In the 25 years since they came into being, they have grown into an organization with assets totaling $240 million, a loan portfolio of almost $190 million, and they work across 5 states. So they've really grown in terms of their scale of their organization, just in terms of the resources that they can draw on. But they've also expanded their scope. They started out as a lender for nonprofits who wanted to work on facilities-related projects. Now, in addition to a loan fund, they also offer real estate consulting and development services. They also have a research and policy department that can help people think about this continuum of where is the field moving, where is need moving, how can you target your services effectively? And then they have a seamless continuum that allows them to get the loan and develop the property to move into those neighborhoods. So again, this is a really great example of scale, but even IFF continues to butt up against challenges and barriers that make it difficult to operate as efficiently as they can because of their scale. So we think about the kinds of recommendations that might help an organization working at scale, and the things that we came to see were very important for government, for funders, for practitioners to think about were, 1, improving systems and networks, making sure we're cutting down on red tape, and actually thinking about how do we make these sort of systems work better together more efficiently. So if you're reporting to 5 different programs, that doesn't mean 5 different data systems and 10 different reports, but how can we actually, harness information and use it more effectively and efficiently to cut red tape? Also, working through high-performance organizations. When you have a high performer with a proven outcome and track record, how do we work through them to deal with some of these issues like the lack of capacity in many communities that are now struggling with the growth in poverty? How can you use that capacity to build from so you're not just starting from scratch in all of these places? And also supporting smart consolidation. Sometimes that means government figuring out how to collapse programs and policies that may be redundant or inefficient and could work better together. Sometimes that's jurisdictions actually realizing that they don't have the scale to deal with these challenges, so maybe they should merge. And it can mean nonprofit organizations making sure that, and rather than trying to take different bites of the apple alone, they could do much more together as one organization. In terms of collaboration and integration, a great example we can come back to is the South Suburbs. So they had a tough time, their first time out of the gate in making this work, but they decided to stay together to continue to work as a collaborative. And since then, they've grown to 23 communities. They've received continual support from regional organizations and local philanthropy. And in fact, they've moved beyond just thinking about housing to thinking about transit-oriented development. How do we think about economic development as a subregion? Broadening the scope and their planning as a subregion to try and get better outcomes for them all. And in fact, they've been able to leverage $25 million in the short time they've been working together to start working on things like a transit-oriented development fund, decision-making tools using GIS and data more efficiently, and actually starting to rehab and deal with the foreclosure crisis and some of the blighted properties. But clearly through their own experience, we know, number 1, what we need to do to pave the way for these sorts of models going forward is identifying those kinds of barriers to collaboration like they faced in that first round of NSP funding. When there really weren't any barriers, it was just a risk aversion to doing something in a new way. So figuring out what those barriers are and reducing them wherever possible in existing funding streams. 2, actually going forward to reward and incentivize collaboration. Maybe not just saying we're going to make it easier for you to do it, but we actually want to reward you for doing that. And that way you're helping not only the people already operating in that way, but you're bringing new communities and organizations to the table to think more collaboratively. And catalyzing regional capacity. Again, you have this issue if money will travel down well-worn paths if we don't really start thinking about how to build capacity in communities that have been overlooked in the past. And finally, on the funding strategically, I think a great example, again, that has come out of the Chicago region is something called the Mortgage Resolution Fund. And this also came in the wake of the foreclosure crisis. But you had 4 nonprofits who saw that there was an opportunity to deal with this crisis in a better, more comprehensive, more cohesive way using their collective skill sets. So they came together to form MRF, and their whole point is to enter into the process sooner to be able to keep homeowners in their home. By doing that, you're helping individuals with their own economic stability and credit scores, et cetera, but you're also helping stabilize communities. And so they were able to negotiate with the Treasury Department to get an enterprise level. That means, they're giving them $100 million to pursue this model. And instead of measuring process or step by step what they were doing, agreeing on goals in the longer term that they want to reach and allowing MRF the kind of flexibility in how they were going to get there. And I think that points to a number of important strategies to be thinking about moving forward in the funding space. One, more enterprise level funding, not getting tied up in the red tape and the procedural part of funding, but really thinking big picture about what are we trying to achieve, and knowing there are a diverse array of communities that need to be helped, allowing flexibility in how you address the needs in different places. Again, working towards an agreed upon outcome. And knowing that the pool of funding is not getting bigger anytime soon across any sector, how do we leverage what we have more effectively? Between public and private sources, what tools do we have at our disposal to make sure that we really are blending these funding sources and leveraging them to stretch further, to help more people in more places? And a lot of this all comes back to data. I mean, again, I'm going to ring the data bell here and say that data is so important. One, just in even understanding where need is. As I think a lot of this data shows, it's often not where you think it is. So how do you understand where it is and who it's touching? But then how do you really collect information on what's working in a way that can help drive decisions and help target limited resources more effectively in the long run? So those are sort of the short-term solutions that we tried to put forward in the book, but we also did some bigger thinking about if we really wanted to try and change the game, the way we address poverty in place, what would we do? And this is where we came up with this idea of a Metropolitan Opportunity Challenge. You take that $82 billion we're already spending every year and repurpose just 5% of it, you get $4 billion. And that money is quite a large pool of money that you can use in a competitive process to try to bring states and metro areas together to think differently about how they promote access to opportunity in their region. So that gives flexibility to places to figure out what is going to be the biggest play you can make to increase access to opportunity in your region. Is that about jobs? Is it about transportation? Is it about education and skill building? There's a flexibility there to identify what you need, and then you put forward your steps for how you're going to get there. Also thinking about how you're leveraging private investment and grappling with this capacity issue in regions where there may not be many boots on the ground, but you know you want to include them in this process. We pull this out in a policy brief and describe it in the book. But we also understand the gridlock right now in Washington doesn't make any big, hairy ideas seem very doable in the short term. But you have regions already, like Chicago, like Seattle, like Houston, and a number of other places that we visited that are already starting to work in this way. And I think that's the opportunity to kind of pilot an approach like this, so you can identify what's working and help lift that up to bring federal policy along in the longer term. And, part of what we also talk about when we give these presentations to policymakers, to funders, to practitioners, is that we didn't, again, just want this to be a book. We really wanted this to be a useful living resource that can help people understand best practices and figure out how to engage in these discussions in their regions for productive ends. And so we have this whole website for the book. It's confrontingsuburbanpoverty.org. Where, yes, you can get the book, but you also can get all of these other resources that we've taken out of the book and continue to build on. So profiles summarizing data for each of the 100 largest metro areas. A lot of the stuff that I talked about in the beginning, localized for your community. We have case studies like the ones that I walk through in terms of the innovations and emerging models that we're seeing. And we're going to continue building on that to help. There's no real natural network for suburban leaders grappling with these issues. So we want to help create that network by sharing these stories, sharing best practices. We also broke out tips for taking action. If you're a funder, what do you do? If you're a policymaker, what do you do? If you're a practitioner, what should you be thinking about? To really try and make this as practical as possible. And for people who are just starting the conversation, we have this very short video, which I encourage you to check out. It was a minute and a half about why suburban poverty matters, and an infographic that walks through exactly what are we facing with the changing landscape of poverty and opportunity. So again, as we go through the Chicago region and in other regions we're visiting with the rollout of the book, this is the sort of information we're trying to bring to different stakeholders and decision makers to package not just the analytics that we did, but what are the recommendations and what can we do about it moving forward. And with that, I think we'll open it up for any questions you might have.
Thank you for your presentation. I had a question about when you and your colleagues are confronted with what appear to be suboptimal decisions that get locked in, how do you identify them? How do you approach them? Do you approach them, etc.? Thank you.
Yes, that's a great question. And it really does depend on the context in which that comes about. I think there's one level analysis that we can do, sitting in Washington, if we're looking at a federal program or we're looking at a regional dynamic where that's the good thing about being in a think tank setting, is that we can say, we don't think this is a good way of doing business. This isn't the most efficient way to run this program, or the cuts that you're proposing don't make a lot of sense for this program. When we're out talking with policymakers, so again, that's a great space to be in, is that you can just be, the data, what they tell me, what they show me is that this is not optimal. And we have recommendations for how to move that way to a better outcome. On a local setting, when you're dealing with local policymakers and decision makers, and you understand, it's the best part about getting out of DC and into regions is the very complicated relationships that go into fueling a lot of the decisions and the context in which these decisions gets made in places. And I think then we become much more politically sensitive to how to engage in those conversations. And that's where it's really helpful, again, because we have a national perspective, that instead of necessarily pointing to a thing within a region and saying, this is really just doesn't make sense, to have a more productive conversation at times, we can point to another region who's doing it differently and say, they're facing something very similar to what you're going through, and this is how they've been problem solving around that. And again, that comparative lens, sometimes taking it out of a region to talk about someplace else, helps free up some space for some more productive conversations.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. Just to clarify, what was the definition of poverty that you were using as your threshold? And then also, is the standard definition, which is sort of the root of all of the other ones, is that particularly problematic in a suburban context than it is problematic otherwise?
Yes. So we do use the official measure, which in 2012, I think was roughly $23,500, something along those lines, for a family of 4. So that is a conservative measure at best, no matter where you're looking. But there are a lot of issues with the official measure, because it is the same measure applied across the country. It's a gross income measure. It doesn't take into account taxes. It doesn't take into account or certain transfers that may actually be helping you be better off. So that there are a lot of issues with the standard measure. But the thing with the measure, and why we continue to use it, is it does give you a benchmark over time by which to measure these trends, and it's the only measure that's available down to a local level of geography, so that we can get down to the neighborhood level to understand these dynamics. The Census Bureau did release supplemental poverty measure starting a few years ago, and they continue to update that. That is an excellent measure. It's actually a much more comprehensive definition of poverty, and it also includes the impact of programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit or food stamps, or things that we know really do make a big difference in moving the needle on poverty and people's ability to get by. The problem is, because it's based on the current population survey, we can't get good estimates of that below the state level, really, and even the state level estimates are not as strong as the national ones. So we continue to use that as an important context in which we talk about these things, but for now we're sort of stuck with that conservative measure of the federal measure.
Hi, this is more of a career question. Did this topic, thank you for coming, by the way.
Sure.
Did this topic choose you, or did you choose this topic? And will you take this forward for the next 5 years and make it your personal mission, or are you about to move on to another topic? Just curious how it works.
Yeah, I very early on in my time at Harris knew that I wanted to work on issues that affected low-income people and communities. And so it was great. I was able to do an internship at the Chicago Community Trust, which is a really wonderful local foundation here. I was able to do an internship at IFF, which gave me a great, besides giving me my first job out of grad school, gave me a really great perspective on applied research, but in the context of addressing needs for disinvested communities and populations. So when I came to Brookings, I had people giving me, I'm a big believer, by the way, in informational interviews. So you really make use of those in your time here, because it's a great way to understand fields you might be interested in, and in even just where the avenues are that to get into things that you know that you're interested in. And I remember doing informational interviews, moving to DC, and talking to people who say, whatever it takes to get in at Brookings, do it. I think that's terrible advice. I actually wouldn't recommend that to you. If they don't listen when somebody says that to you, because in reality, if there's a job, even if it's a place you really want to work, if it's a job that is just not a good fit for you, that's not the way you want to get in the door. Because then you're just setting yourself up for frustration and for not even showing yourself with the best foot forward, because it's not something that's suited to you. So I was very hesitant about that kind of advice, and actually passed up an opportunity that came up at Brookings because I didn't think it was the right fit for me, and was rewarded in doing that because this position came open, the one that I was hired as a research analyst, and have been able to work my way up to fellow over time. And it was because I found the right fit. It was something where it was working on tax policies for low-income communities. It was working on demographics and poverty trends across cities and suburbs. And it was actually the very first paper that I wrote there that uncovered this trend. That it was the first paper I worked on with my boss, Alan Berube. And we saw that when the 2005 census data came out from the American Community Survey, there were now more poor people in suburbs than in cities. And that sparked this whole series of research wanting to understand that. So I will say we did not set out to study suburban poverty. We were really much more focused on urban poverty at the time, but really seeing this as a new trend unfolding that we wanted to know more about. And so I do think that I will continue in all of my work to focus on issues that affect low-income people in places, but maybe that work will shift as the geography shifts. The other thing I will say is that doing this has given me an opportunity to not just study poverty, but all the things that intersect with poverty. So in my time at Brookings, I've been able to write a paper on crime trends across cities and suburbs, on transit access across cities and suburbs, affordable housing. So that's also been really satisfying, is the ability to look at something under a bigger tent, really understanding the things that intersect with it, rather than just narrowly focusing on one part of the poverty picture.
Hi. Great presentation.
Could you wave at me? I'm thank you.
Here,
okay.
Sorry. Yeah, I want to echo, it's a great presentation as well. Just on the suburban poverty, I'm from a city, I know a lot of us are. Do you look at this as, from like a person from a city, we look at some of the suburban policies maybe as just being, well, maybe we should make our cities more attractive to combat some of the spatial problems, some of the infrastructural problems, like did the suburbs grow too quickly? Do you think it's a suburban issue, or do you think it's we need to urbanize some more of our population?
I really do think it's a regional issue, because I think another thing, we talk about suburban poverty because I do think it's the aha moment of like things are really shifting, and it's important to understand the regional reach of poverty and how many more people in places are struggling with this. But I also, in the book, I think and in talking about it, we also really try to underscore that this shouldn't be a zero-sum game, for one, about, we didn't solve poverty in the city. It's just that now cities are struggling as well. So it's not like a shell game where we shift things around. You have to think more strategically about increasing access to opportunity is sort of the language we use. So in cities, that might mean some of the traditional community development strategies that we've seen over the years, like trying to introduce opportunities into distressed neighborhoods with more mixed income housing, better job opportunities, better education opportunities. But, we also think about like the use of housing choice vouchers, and those are increasingly used in suburbs. That was on purpose to try and get people out of concentrated poverty. Yet we didn't follow that policy with a discussion of how do you use this voucher to really make sure you're moving to a more higher opportunity place. A lot of people with vouchers end up in low-income suburbs. So I think it's more of thinking within a regional context about where can we increase opportunities within communities, but also as we think about opening up opportunities region-wide, making sure people have the information and resources to connect to those. So again, we're not just shifting from one part of the region to the other, but thinking holistically about moving the region forward.
Hi, I had one question about public housing in Chicago, and especially the high-rises that were torn down and then there weren't enough low-income housing or affordable housing for those residents. How much do you think the shift of poverty to the suburbs is a deliberate, or has been a deliberate, policy decision by people in the city?
So, I mean, that's definitely part of the picture. But just like when we talk about immigration, I think it's really important to underscore that's not the whole thing. That's just a small piece of the puzzle, and it's not enough to explain the really huge shifts that we've seen. So that's a piece of it. But then we also have to look to just larger economic issues that operate at a regional level, across cities and suburbs, like how do downturns impact these areas, but also how does the structure of the economy look? Where are jobs and what kinds of wages do they pay? Because in the long run, that also really affects these trends.
Hi, so I have a question about healthcare in these sorts of populations. Cities have urbanized community health centers. They have, county health systems, those sorts of things. And suburbs tend to not be organized in that way. And so I think a lot of patients have no place to go or end up sitting in ERs. So what have you seen in your research about that?
Yeah, that's actually, that's an area that we would like to study much more in depth when we think about the geography of service providers, but also social determinants of health and those conversations that are really developing now. But what we've seen in our travels anecdotally really matches up to what you just said, that there are often just not those sort of options available in suburban communities. So they're forced to either go to emergency rooms, or try to go back into the city, which again can be difficult if you don't have a dependable car or public transit available. And that geography of those service providers, even, community health clinics, really has not adapted to the suburban reach of the need these days. So that's definitely a gap that we've seen in suburban areas. But again, we've seen some really interesting, I think, leaders in certain regions trying to think more regionally about how to connect people to those opportunities and expand that kind of capacity.
We got time for one more.
Has there been any sort of criticism or people being upset from cities thinking that you're basically saying, oh, you should divert more money out to the suburbs and no longer fund our programs? Or do people generally understand that it's not a zero-sum game and it's okay?
Yeah, there's definitely been concerns. I would say not even just from big city officials, but even from some service providers who are very anchored in urban communities that they would be worried that this, while we aren't saying shift the resources, would be used as an excuse to have a not very thoughtful conversation about cutting resources to the city and delivering to them to the suburbs. So I think that what we're trying to do with those partners and in those cases is really hold up the sort of regional examples and the models that we've seen where cities and suburbs can work together on these issues as well. And it is happening in certain places. So again, I think it comes back to the public education piece, just sharing the stories, trying to show them a reality in which this can work better for people across the region, rather than coming from a combative and competitive situation that really isn't good for people in cities or suburbs in the long run. Well, thank you all again for having me here, and I hope that was helpful. And really good luck to you all. Enjoy your 2 years here. Make the most of them. And I look forward to hearing you speak at an alumni event someday in the future. So
Absolute proof that you will live through this program and get a job.
I've seen the other side. It can happen. All right. Bye, everybody. Thank you.